For people who are a little bit older that want to get into flying, your background is not lost in the transition. You actually carry it through the transition because it's those diverse experiences that are going to set you apart as a more well-rounded pilot in whatever kind of vocation you're going after.
How many people go through life doing work they really don't like, but every day dreaming of, say, working in the aviation industry? They say it's too late. They think it would be too hard. They think it would go against conventional norms. If you never go after what you want, you'll never have it. This is Fly the Transition. Join us as we soar through the captivating stories of individuals embracing a thrilling journey into the aviation industry. From pilots spreading their wings to mechanics fine-tuning the engines and a myriad of industry professionals, each with a unique tale to tell. Get ready to dive into the diverse backgrounds, the pivotal moments that propelled their leap, and the sheer determination that transformed their aspirations into reality. We're not just about dreams. We're about making them take flight. Welcome to Fly the Transition. And now your host, Jim Schilling.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Fly the Transition. I'm your host, Jim Schilling. Happy to have you back as we jump into another journey of aviation career transformation. On this episode, I'm excited to welcome CFI Richard Donaldson. He brings a wealth of experience from his diverse background in Silicon Valley in the tech industry. At age 53, Richard caught the aviation bug and took the plunge into this incredible field. We'll dive deeper into his story in just a bit. Before we do that, I want to give you just a quick update on my own CFI journey. Last time I talked about my VOR lesson plan and how I was still kind of working out some of the stiffness on the ground portion, and though it's still not as smooth as I'd like it to be, I'm sure that over time as I continue to tweak that and modify it, as long as I don't overcomplicate it, it should continue to improve in the future. Very much related to that, the plane is out of annual inspection and back in the air, so I was able to not only do the ground portion of the VOR training, but I also went up and did the airwork part of it. The intercepting and tracking of the VOR radials, figuring out where we are in space, things like that. And I find it so much easier for me personally to teach that in the air as opposed to on the ground. I'm able to give, the theory of it on the ground, but for whatever reason for me personally, once I'm in the air, I feel more confident in explaining it, demonstrating it, and overall, once we did it in the air, I just felt so much more confident with that lesson and my VOR instruction. What still comes as just a little bit of a challenge for me is the right seat landings. I'm able to demonstrate and do all sorts of other stuff from the right seat, but something about those landings is just still continued to elude me on a consistent basis. So that flight where I was talking about the VORs, we went back after the VOR work and did some of those right seat landings, still just not quite getting that sight picture down on that flight. But that same evening, I went back up with the goal of I really have to clean these up. I went up solo that time from the right seat and just continued to work on those landings until that sight picture and the process and all that stuff started to feel a little bit more natural. I think there's really something to be said about the muscle memory that we develop flying from the left seat. And when you make that move into the right seat, just the ability to retrain your brain, not just for that sight picture, but for the muscle memory of how you're working the controls and things like that. Also on that solo flight, I put some cameras in the plane just for my own debriefing purposes. And I found that the more I was talking to myself and talking through what I was doing, the smoother my landings would end up being. So just verbalizing the steps, this checklist, what I was seeing, the corrections I was making, really not that much unlike what an instructor might do as they're demonstrating landings. The landings just continued to improve, so I felt pretty confident at the end of that solo flight. So just because I put some cameras in there doesn't mean that I'm throwing it all over YouTube or anything like that. It was just a valuable tool for me to rewatch some of my landings and help me enhance my flying skills. I'll probably continue to record those flights for my own debriefing, but who knows, maybe in the future I'll throw those together for CFI Journey video series or something like that. Well after I'm done with my CFI process, because that's the priority right now. Up next, I want to give you an update from one of our previous guests. You may remember Hollywood cameraman Eric Fletcher. He recently obtained his ATP during his recurrent training, so huge congratulations goes out to him. We'll be sure to bring him back on a future episode, and he can discuss more about that process for him. Now on to this episode's interview. We'll be talking with Richard Donaldson, who is a flight instructor based in the Phoenix area. Before his aviation career, he worked in technology infrastructure, data centers, and later in the global supply chain industry. He even hosted a podcast called Supplychain Next. Richard's journey into aviation began during the global pandemic. He had moved into a major hub for aviation training in the Phoenix area and took a discovery flight and never looked back. So let's welcome Richard Donaldson to the Fly the Transition podcast. All right, Richard, thank you for joining me on the Fly the Transition podcast. Really happy to have you.
Hey, I'm glad to be here, Jim. And when you reached out and told me about flying the transition, I not only did I get excited because that's literally what I'm going through, and not by design. I'm so thrilled with the choice that I've made, and I'm hoping that maybe a few other people can listen in and realize that it's not that big of a deal, especially later in life as a second or third career.
Yeah, that's kind of the goal we're trying to get to, sharing those stories and letting people know that these things are attainable. You don't have to be completely freaked out by it or think that you can't do it. So,
exactly.
Well, let's jump right into things then. How were you first exposed to aviation? Is this something that you grew up with, something you got into later in life, something else?
Yeah, great start off. So I actually had an uncle. I've written a few articles for Flying Magazine, just a couple, and they're fortunate to publish a couple on my private pilot, my instrument, and I definitely give credit to. I had an uncle who was a pilot, GA, and at the time I didn't really appreciate all that he went through, and especially in that era, pre-glass panels.
Yeah.
So I have a huge amount of respect for the original flying folks, especially now being a CFI II and working on my MEI and opening a flight school myself. But my uncle was a big inspiration. And I was fortunate enough to have some other exposure to private travel early on. So, I mean, I had the bug. Oh, I loved it. But I'll be honest with you, I had a huge fear of heights. And that's something I've always had. So I've done a bunch of things through my life to sort of conquer those things, not short of which is flying, but also now skydiving and rock climbing and things like that.
Well, you've conquered your fear of heights way more than I have, because I won't do those last two things you said.
Yeah.
Not happening.
Right.
So that early exposure, was there anything that you did growing up then? Did you fly with them, or is that something that you started to pursue?
It was great. Yeah, he was a twin engine pilot.
Okay.
I'm so embarrassed to say I can't remember exactly what he had. But this was in the East Coast. He was actually out of Connecticut. And one of my favorite stories is he graciously said one time when I went to school out east in upstate New York, a little school called Colgate University.
Okay.
And lo and behold, to me at the time, he looked it up when we were there. There was a small little airstrip in Hamilton, New York. And so he offered one time, he's like, hey, you want me to fly you to school? And I was like, well, that sounds like a lot of fun. And so we bolted from Connecticut over to New York. And it was probably only about an hour and a half flight, but I just vividly remember, in my head going, oh my God, and landing at this non-towered strip in the middle of nowhere in his twin engine. And again, now that I think about it, I mean, all that went into it, his flight planning, his ability to get in and out of there, a non-towered airport, I'm in awe. Right. At the time, I just didn't realize all that was going on behind the scenes as he was kind of crafting that flight together. But what sparked me was like, wow, what freedom that is to have that, and how cool it is to be up in the air and to be able to do all that, and just the places that you can go. And later in life, and we'll get to it, I had some friends of mine in we'll call it my primary career till now, which was in Silicon Valley, who did relatively well. And I actually had a friend of mine who kind of semi-retired a little bit early, did well in a technology startup. And he spent a year, loaded his plane up and decided to fly around the country to small airports and do camping kind of trips.
Oh, that sounds fun.
Oh God, he was so cool. And I was like, especially later in life after, kind of growing up a little bit and thinking about it, I was like, wow, that is just an amazing way to do it. So, and then started to actually run into a couple of people. I actually had a colleague of mine I worked at eBay for a little bit. People probably heard of that. And one of my colleagues there, so a couple. He was a pilot. And I just remember one day, actually, he worked for me. And he was like, hey, man, you want to go, grab some dinner down in Monterey? And I was like, oh, that sounds cool. Like, God, it's like a 3-hour drive, though. He's like, no, we'll fly down. I was like, oh, God. So jumped in his plane, and we busted down there. It was a little hour flight, and it was a little flying club. So there was like 4 or 5 of us. Everyone landed. We all had dinner, came back. And again, that was one of those other sparks. I was like, this is something I got to check out in life that I was able to do that, start to make that transition.
Well, cool. So early on, as you're kind of exploring careers and directions, aviation wasn't like the path for you, right?
I definitely did not have a normal path in pretty much anything I did. So let me make that caveat. Even in college, I was only really on campus for about 3 years. I went to school over in Europe, skipped a semester because I was working over there for a little while. While I was working over there, I had some people that I worked with who, and it's kind of an odd thing to say, but I was working in, of all things, oil trading, which sounds weird. And I was doing fulfillment side to it. And the people that I worked with were in their early to mid 30s. And they told me then, said, hey, we're happy to have you come back and work for us after college, but we're going to give you some advice, which is you're not going to have your post-collegiate years and that freedom ever again. And I literally, the sentences didn't end. And I knew I needed to go. And I after I graduated college, I sort of struck off and did some odd jobs, traveling for about 5 years. I was a chef and a scuba instructor and a ski instructor, and kind of worked my way around the country in some pretty interesting locations like Alaska and Hawaii and Colorado and Nantucket. And then kind of got to the end of that and found myself going, what do I want to do? And I decided to move to San Francisco. And this internet thing was kind of taking off.
Sure.
And so I decided to sort of jump into that and really spent the next close to 25 years there building a career in, of all things, technology, big infrastructure like data centers and networks, startups, very heavily involved in that community there. And that carried me through. But it wasn't that I had a path. Like, some people come out and they want to be a doctor or they want to be an engineer. I was never that person. I kind of followed a little bit where things were going, and it somehow worked out as I kept doing it.
So all those years ago, you go into San Francisco and into the technology side of things with the internet starting up and starting to boom. So talk to me a little bit about that process, like how you got into things and like where you started within that field.
Yeah, well, one of the things, and it's actually also helped me a lot in my initial progression in aviation, is really networking. And I think one of the key elements of anything in Silicon Valley, if I really peeled the onion back a little bit, and sure, technology acumen and knowing certain things, being a self-studied person, very motivated to learn, very curious, always asking why. That's sort of the entrepreneurial spirit. Don't get me wrong, college and higher learning is great, but if you're in the forefront of technology, a book is going to be already dated, right? So you have to be ahead of the curve.
Yep.
And really kind of inquisitive. So I started my career in Silicon Valley in all things. Investment banking was my sort of launching point. So I got into investment banking in 1997, 1998, worked for a firm called Montgomery Securities. And at the time, I said to myself, hey, if I want to get into this whole kind of technology stuff, what a great place to go, kind of get a view of what's going on, the kind of funding sources.
Okay.
And I moved into consulting, economic consulting of all things. And so I built a real foundation of business knowledge, business acumen, how to tear apart financial statements. And that parlayed into my first startup where I was pulled into, not as a founder, but as an employee very early. It was called Tech Planet. And it was an early version of the Geek Squad. So the Geek Squad started in Minneapolis and very successful, obviously. And we've all heard of that through Best Buy. Tech Planet was the Silicon Valley version. And as I like to say, we were the antithesis of the success of the guys at Best Buy. We actually went out and raised $20 million and then blew $20 million in about 15 months.
Good grief.
It was a catastrophic failure. But coming out of that, learned so much about what not to do, right? At that time, and people have heard the stories, it was a crazy period. Money was being thrown all over the place. There was the term irrational exuberance. That was absolutely true. If you had a .com in your name, and people almost can't believe it, and this is all 20 years ago, people would throw $5 million at you just for having a .com in your name. So we were sort of one of the recipients of that, and had all this kind of hoopla, then fizzled out very quickly. And then I moved into another startup that was focused on technology education for older adults.
Okay.
was a good idea, but that was called Senior Surfers, but it was probably about 10, maybe 15 years ahead of its time. You're thinking about these problems or seeing these problems that sometimes the market isn't even aware of yet. And that's a challenge. There's
Sure.
many business plans that are absolutely on point, but they're just too early. They mistime the market. And that's one of the sort of big failures that people realize. So, and then on top of which, what hurt us at the time is 9/11 came around, and that really froze everything, and we were fundraising. So we actually pulled the plug on that. And then I got into parlayed into this sort of data center startup or co-location services. And as big as everything is today, and some people probably haven't even heard of data centers, that's the backbone physical infrastructure of the internet. Those companies were just forming up at the time.
So when you're working with these startups, what kind of roles are you having within these companies?
So I generally was on so we'll call it the strategy, marketing, I call it the storytelling side of the equation, right? So, why, what is the problem we're attacking? Why are we attacking this problem? What's the solution we have to solve for this problem? Why is it even relevant to anybody?
Sure.
That was a lot of what I did. Inherently within all of that, there's a lot of selling, fundraising. At one point, I actually had a startup that I was the founding CEO of, and I did the adventure of raising money from the venture capital companies, and went through the whole, I think when I counted it, it was about 46 presentations, 45 no's, and 1 yes.
Wow.
Yeah, but that's normal, right? That's normal. That's how you have to do it. And you learn real quick rejection. You learn real quick about, how to take, you develop real thick skin. But you can't be so obtuse that you're not paying attention to what people are critiquing. Oftentimes they're maybe not on point, and you got to kind of have a real passion for what you're doing, because you're going to get a lot of negativity thrown at you. But that was invaluable.
I think a lot of people probably take for granted all the things that are happening in the backgrounds for all the things that you use today, technology wise or otherwise. Like you're talking about, making all these presentations to these venture capital groups, and how much work is really going into that. I think there's just a lot of people that don't understand that.
Yeah, and fair. And I even think, to your point, and you've been around long enough, you've seen this technology evolve. I mean, it's really kind of startling when you think for a second, 20 years ago, we wouldn't be having this podcast right now. We wouldn't have the technology to support this type of video calls. I mean, the rate of change that's occurred over the last 20 years is, astounding, right? I mean, it almost both people's in headsets. And also, to your point, the technology has advanced so much. The phrase here is, technology is not sufficiently advanced enough until it appears magical. So kind of to your point, a lot of the stuff sort of drifts to the background. And even things like, I always just like to, especially when connectivity started showing up on airplanes, for example. I did a lot of traveling during my career. All of a sudden one day, you have Wi-Fi on the airplane. Yeah. And a few years later, all of a sudden people are complaining they're not getting great download speeds. I'm like, right. Anybody here realize what's actually happening? I mean, there's a satellite up there, and you're beaming transmissions to a moving target at 700 miles an hour going through the air. Right. I mean, it's astounding that you can get from A to B. And by the way, let me pause for a second. Aviation itself is only about 110 years old.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Orville and Wilbur cranked up that first plane in the early 1900s. And so think about that in context, right? Where we are today. And we've gone from not flying to now planning missions to Mars. And that's all in the space of about 105 years. So that alone tells you how fast things are moving.
Yeah. So from eBay, you go into supply chain work. So for those that don't understand what that is, tell me a little bit more about what that field is.
Yeah. So the way I paint the problem is there's 3 principal numbers that I always kind of blow people away with, which is the population of the planet stands at 8 billion people today. The global economy recently measured at about $5 trillion globally. That's the aggregate GDP. And we extract from the earth 100 billion tons of materials to feed that supply chain. And that consists, iron ore, aluminum. I mean, it's all your kind of mind, even all the way to cotton and, food supply, agri supply. So 8 billion people, $105 trillion global economy, 100 billion tons of stuff connects all that together, right? And that really is the global supply chain in a nutshell. And what we're seeing today is, like everything else, technology has still been a little bit slowly adopted in the global supply chain, and where the global supply chain has been evolving over hundreds and hundreds of years, all the way back to, the Dutch East India Company, for goodness sake, shipping routes. So again, people take for granted that stuff gets transported via containers and how advanced that is.
Sure.
Well, we're still at a very transitional phase in the world of the global supply chain, whereby technology is now being driven into the asset management, the kind of asset planning, the digitization of that global supply chain, so you have transparency and see where everything is. I'll give you a great example. During the pandemic, obviously supply chain became very top of mind because things got clogged up around the world. One of which was PPE equipment, right?
Yeah.
The masks and whatever. Here's the rub. It wasn't that we ran out of PPE equipment. There was quite plenty globally. We just didn't know where all of it was in a timely fashion. So that really paints the picture of what the global supply chain, is trying to do right now, is to bring kind of what I call the Amazonification that we've grown accustomed to in our consumer lives, where we can all sit down and order a, pencil, for goodness sakes, or a toothbrush.
Yeah.
And we know when, where it leaves, how it gets to our house, when it's getting to our house. We can plan to be there if we want to pick up the package. I mean, goodness sakes, right? The consumer supply chain is really quite advanced. The industrial supply chain is decades behind that still. And so that's, things that supply chain companies or supply chain startups or supply chain technologies are trying to address today. And my company was very much in the middle of that in Request, where we were really trying to connect all of the suppliers and the buyers on one singular platform. And it did a couple things. It allowed us to not only be able to see where all the assets were from point of origination to destination, but then teed us up for something called, you may have heard this term, called circularity, right? Where we began to look at the used supply, or the assets that were in use when they were coming of age, and when we could feed them back into the supply chain. Because if I go back to that 100 billion tons of stuff we pull out of the earth every year, one of the shocking statistics is about 40% of that is wasted before it ever gets to first use. And that's not sustainable. So, one of my big kind of themes in my own podcast, Supply Chain Next, is that concept of circularity, where, and again, that's a hot topic right now. We've been talking, this isn't recycling. This is really about taking the entire supply chain, which is linear, right? Where we have, stuff we pull out of the ground, gets, refined and manufactured and then used and then dumped into a waste fill, or, God forbid, in the ocean or something like that, which is a problem. Instead, think more along the lines of taking all those goods and, getting them back into either extended use, alternate uses. You can repart them out for recycling, because we really have more than enough stuff. So supply chain is not only being digitized, it's also being twisted to become circular, right? And those are the two big themes within supply chain that are probably going to persist over the course of the next 7 to 10 years.
Interesting. So what was your work within that field?
Well, I actually was building an entire platform to service our eBay supply chain at the time, and realized real quickly, and that was computers, obviously. So we were, buying hundreds of millions of dollars of computers every year and using them for 3 years and then replacing them with new computers. So we're trying to figure out how to onboard them, offboard them, get them out to use, get residual value for those things, because we spent quite a bit of money, and those 3-year computers were still good, but realized real quickly that this was something that more people could use in the technology space. And then as it began to kind of step out of that, we actually got approached by some people in the world for aviation parts, right? So as we kind of drift into even aviation speak, there's a huge global market for aftermarket aviation parts, as we all know, right? So servicing your 1956, 172, you need to find parts. That's hard to do. There's a lot of used and refurbished parts that make quite a bit of money out there to keep everything going. And that's just not Cessnas. That's all the way up through Boeings and Airbuses, right?
Sure.
So even a Boeing and an Airbus, I've got a friend of mine now that I've met also now that I've been in aviation, and some people would have known him. He runs nomadic aviation, and he actually does it's an amazing job. He and his buddies have built a business where they deliver aftermarket Boeing and Airbuses around the world. So it's part 91 flying, but a case example is the president of Mexico recently sold a custom, I think it was a 767 that they bought back in, God only knows, 2010 or something like that. and sold it, I kid you not, people can look this up, to the president of Tajikistan. And so Bob, and he goes by Captain Bedbug on TikTok if people want to look him up. He was contracted to deliver that 767 to Tajikistan. And as he and a couple of people jumped in the plane and checked it out and flew it over there.
Wow.
But when you think about it, is in this case, United or Delta or Lufthansa might buy, a Boeing ships around 750 brand new planes per year, Airbus about the same. So it's about 1,500 brand new planes per year. Well, the people who buy them at about $250 million per plane. That's pretty expensive. So not everyone can afford that. If you're in a, second world, third world country, or you're, not FedEx or UPS buying new planes, you're buying used planes in your cargo business in the middle of South America, you will buy the 10, 15-year-old United plane and use it for another 20 or 30 years. And so he has built quite a niche business of delivering those planes. And that's even a job in aviation that, again, I didn't realize existed until I got into aviation, started meeting some people. And I'm like, oh my God, that sounds like a lot of fun. I don't need to be a captain at United. I can actually fly a plane that has no passengers and no cargo.
Yeah. Just
I
very
just
fun.
Take it around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we continue with this episode, a quick word from those who make the Fly the Transition podcast possible. Hey there, aviation friends. I want to tell you about my friends over at Pilot Quarters. This Midwest family-owned business is ready to make your next favorite flying shirt. They offer a wide variety of chart-inspired camp shirts, polos, sundresses, and tees. You can shop by your state, your region, or even reach out to the guys for special requests. They're great shirts, they're great conversation pieces, and I know that I personally would be sporting mine at AirVenture in just a few weeks. So check the guys out over at pilotquarters.com today and soar in style. Are you a fan of the podcast that wants to show off your support at your next aviation event? Well, check out our awesome merch. We have t-shirts, hats, and more featuring our vibrant full-color logo, or if you prefer something a bit more subtle, go with the black stamp design. All of our shirts come in a variety of colors, so you can find the perfect fit for your style. Head on over to flymidwest.com/merch today to grab yours. We are entering the peak of summer flying season, and that means it's time to upgrade your eyewear with Flying Eyes. These aviation-inspired sunglasses feature a sleek, durable, and impact-resistant design. Their gradient lenses are perfect for pilots, providing maximum ease in reading your instrument panel. Say goodbye to those headache-inducing gas station sunglasses that fit poorly with your headset. Flying Eyes is designed by pilots for pilots to ensure superior comfort, even on the longest flights. Head on down to the affiliate link down in our show notes and enter code FlyMidwest10 for 10% off your next purchase at Flying Eyes.
You're listening to Fly the Transition. If you've ever thought about changing careers and getting into the aviation industry, welcome to your new home. Now, back to your host, Jim Schilling.
What were the next steps in your journey?
Yeah, you got it. So Reckless was founded in 2010, still exists today. Be honest, things were kind of not going well in the Bay Area. It was getting a little tough, and then the pandemic hit. And I'll just say it right now, in retrospect, it didn't necessarily do the greatest job of trying to keep people around. It got a little Orwellian, just was not a good place to be. It was definitely a sign of the times for me to bug out of there. And I didn't have a plan necessarily, but I relocated down to Scottsdale, a little town just north of Scottsdale called Carefree outside of Phoenix in Arizona. And landed here, was still with Reckless at the time. And I did plan it out, but the way things were working and the way the schedule was working, we were a virtual company. I had some time, and it was just like, hey, why not? And I looked into why not take a flight lesson. So March of 21, I think it was, decided to take my first discovery flight and loved it so much. I just jumped in with both feet, and next thing you know, I'm kind of plowing through instrument, plowing through commercial, plowing through multi. Next thing you know, I'm a CFI. And as I kind of sort of got into about instrument or commercial, that's when I realized I was still kind of playing with it. I realized, oh my God, there's actually quite a career opportunity here. But I really got bit by the aviation bug, and I saw some of these younger kids, the 20-somethings kind of plowing through, making their way into captains and first officers. But I also didn't also understand the money that that aviators make, right? Now, if you're a professional aviator and you're in aviation and you do make your way into the United or Deltas or what have you, and you have a 30-year career, whatever, 40-year career, whatever it is today, if you look at the lifetime earnings of a pilot, especially a captain at United or the majors, and you total that all up, they're the equivalent. Again, aviators and lifetime career earnings can be the equivalent of U.S. surgeons, which is pretty startling for most people, right? I didn't know that, and so that's when my eyes started to open. I was like, oh my God, like if I really busted my ass and hunkered down and got into the places where I could rack up the most hours and seek some opportunities, fortunately, which I've been able to sort of develop, there's a chance for me. So why not try something kind of fun at this point? Definitely a different perspective. You turn 50, you start kind of reevaluating what you want to do and be, and I'm still waiting to grow up. So, that hasn't happened yet, but I'm getting there. And, but really kind of came to the realization, like really sat down, like, what do I want to do for the next 20 years, 25 years? And why not do something that's different, that's a lot of fun, way more enjoyable for me now to be able to get out, maybe even fly and teach and show people the pathway to even get into aviation. So that's why I really wanted to become an instructor. And, as I kind of got into instruction, I get to see other people develop their skills and make mistakes their own ways, which in turn helps me learn even more.
That's great. And I kind of agree with the same thing. Like I've been working through my CFI process myself. I've kind of learned the same thing as I'm preparing lesson plans and things like that. And she's throwing things at me. I'm learning myself. So it's been really eye-opening.
If you're an instructor, you're going to be forced to live through all these different experiences. And I guarantee you, when you're teaching, you're going to see some things that, quite frankly, you might not otherwise see. That experience is invaluable. Case in point, just had an experience the other night with a student, and he was coming in and he was trying to avoid what he thought was a porpoise of all things. Kind of did a little bit nose down and catch him right away, but he didn't, and he actually landed on the rear wheels just fine, but we kind of bounced, gunned it out of there, and it was fine. Everything was under control. We did everything fine, but it wasn't something that I would do, right? And that's a great example of where I really saw an experience where, I've learned to land and been fortunate enough, I've screwed some landings up like we all do. But I'd never done something like this. And it gave me, I saw a perspective of how the plane operates. I saw the capability of the plane to kind of lurch out of there. We weren't quite at stall speed and things that I was able to reflect on that I never would have manifested in my own flying. And that's a great example of learning through teaching.
So I want to go back for a second with you're plugging through your ratings. At what point did you decide, as you're going kind of between instrument and commercial, you decided you want to go that route, right?
It's right about instrument commercial. I mean, I've been again fortunate enough here. I did most of my training here at Scottsdale. Another thing I didn't quite realize, and again, I am just that why guy, right? So I can't help it. I'm very inquisitive. And I quickly surmised that Arizona, in particular, Phoenix area, and more specifically, is probably the world's, Florida and Arizona are probably the top two destinations in the world. And Arizona, I believe, kind of outpaces that due to our weather here as far as destinations for flight training in the world, right? In the world. And I'm talking international students from all over the world come here because, again, what a lot of people don't realize is if you're going to be in aviation globally, you have to speak English. There's one common language across all aviators, no matter where you are. So if you're a Japanese flagged Air Nippon Airlines captain landing in Tokyo, you're speaking English. And that also, I was like, I'm sort of in the epicenter of flight training. So that was pretty cool. Started kind of getting a feel for that. And then even my first private, and I say my cross country, I had to do a Bravo transition just to get out of here. At the time, I didn't even think about it. The complexity of the airspace, what you're learning right out of the gun, flying in and out of Scottsdale, it's one of the busiest airports around with all the private traffic. It's kind of like being thrown in the deep end, right? You learn real quick what traffic is. You got to be on your game, scanning for everything. You got to be on the comms. You don't want to bust spaces. So you inherently develop those skills. Whereas as I started kind of going through and meeting other aviators as they were progressing from other parts of the world coming here for different ratings, I heard stories from people that were in, all credit to them, but say middle of Texas, doing everything to get through, but they never really seen traffic like they see here. And so it can be a bit overwhelming. And so learning here, again, wasn't by plan. I happened to sort of land in a great place to learn. it's a very complex place to learn. Your skills as a pilot and future kind of professional aviator are going to be really well honed here. But then on top of which, because there's so much aviation activity, the networking here is almost second to none, right? You're going to meet everybody from, your flex jets, net jets to captains, all the major airlines, because a lot of them live.
So when you're thinking about making that career move then, did you have an idea of what you want to do in aviation, or did an opportunity present itself? Or
yeah, I kind of looked at it a little bit structured. I knew I needed to get the hours, and I knew I needed to get to. First and foremost, let's be honest. Coming up through, I did a. I think you asked in one of the questions before the show. Kind of did a back of the envelope, and to get through to my CFI, I think all in was somewhere around $85,000. Right.
Okay.
Rentals and everything else that goes with it, and yada yada yada. That's about right. If you go look out and put some charts out there, there's some data if you Google around. That's give or take a little bit. That's not too far off. So I knew I needed to. Couldn't keep spending at that clip. It was an investment to kind of put myself on the path towards making some money. So rather than go, and there's that gap. You're at 250 hours when you're at your instrument. Maybe you're around 300 or something like that as you get through to commercial or CFI. Maybe 350. Still got 1,200 hours you got to go rack up somewhere. Well, I wasn't going to do that privately. I wasn't going to go buy a plane and just fly around. So I knew I wanted to go find some of those menial jobs that, you can do, or whatever, those startup jobs. And teaching is obviously one of them. I even went down and I've tried to do my hand a little skydive piloting as well, too. So I've been doing that here at a place called Skydive Phoenix. Because those were things that I was interested in, which got me into skydiving. It's a whole different story. We'll segue into that one. Different type of. So I kind of knew I wanted to do that. I didn't want to be a banner tow. I didn't want to go do pipeline flying or anything like that. So and those two things happen to be pretty prevalent here.
Sure.
So I had a plan, and I put the plan together to get through my CFI. And then once I had my CFI, I knew I had to get my double I. And now I'm just finishing my MEI. And that gives me all kind of 3 credentials there. Can teach anything. And then was fortunate enough through a lot of the networking things I was doing, getting in, meeting people and chatting people up, that I met a guy who was founding a flight school in this jet business, and hit it off, and have been able to kind of segue in there to help build the actual flight school now. So, and it's not that I have like oodles of extraction background in aviation per se, but I have a lot of background in teaching. Yeah. And I have a lot of general business acumen that lends itself to helping to build this thing, so it's whereas a lot of younger pilots and pilots in general, and this actually goes to the point of the podcast here at the transition, as people coming out of school and they're 20-somethings, no discredit, they only know one thing, they know aviation. So they're pilots who eventually might learn about business, right? Doesn't necessarily mean they know much about business, but they certainly are great pilots, right? And it's like doctors or lawyers, a surgeon's a great surgeon, doesn't necessarily mean they're a great business person, right? So I'm coming at it with a fairly good background in business and some decent education experiences in teaching. And again, like I said, I taught scuba diving for a few years and skiing and stuff like that. So teaching flying was a natural extension for me. But the business, I'd be honest, is what really kind of, set me a little bit different apart from a lot of the people that they had been talking to.
Okay.
And so for people who are a little bit older that want to get into flying, you're 40-something, maybe in a career, or even 50-something, your background is not lost in the transition. You actually carry it through the transition, because it's those diverse experiences that are going to set you apart as a more, well-rounded pilot in whatever kind of vocation you're going after. Right now, if you're going into the majors, that's one thing. But if you wanted to get into some of the charter stuff or teaching, building schools, there's a lot of opportunities, even building, flying technology, for goodness sake, right? Technology within flying is moving at a very torrid pace right now.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of opportunity almost in a general business sense.
You raise a great point that those skills don't just go away now that you've gone into a new profession, that they can help carry you through that, whether it be a big one I hear a lot is communication skills or working as a team, because you're in an aircraft. A lot of times you're working in a crewed environment. And working on teams, whether it be in business, construction, like you said, that helps prepare folks for working in that team environment.
Big fan of a guy named Elon Musk. I think people have heard of him. He's been around.
I've heard of him, I think.
Yeah, I think some people have. And again, it can strike some chords with people. But regardless, the point that I'm bringing up is, A lot of people look at, I mean, if you just look at the diversity of things he's involved in, whether it's Tesla or SpaceX or, now even acquiring X, which is a different thing. I can talk about that. But he was one of the co-founders of PayPal. And so he was part of the PayPal mafia. And all of those guys that early on that were successful with that went on, and they're very different in Silicon Valley, very Silicon Valley lore here. That group of people went on to be successful in 2, 3, 4 other things, right? And that's really rare, right?
Sure.
Usually you're successful at one thing. Maybe you might be lucky enough the second time around. It just seems like everything he touches something, it's awesome, right? But underneath the covers is kind of what we're talking about. He built a core understanding of how to not only build a business, but build a team, see an opportunity, execute on that. So those general skills, that general framework, he's been able to apply to what normally would appear as very incompatible industries.
Sure.
But the fundamentals are still the same. And that's kind of the point about bringing your, former career into aviation. You don't lose it. It only enhances it.
Great points. So I want to talk a bit about starting at flight school and what that all entails. So how big is the school that you guys have right now? I mean, a couple planes, more than that?
Yeah, no, we're started right now. So it's called Fly Nexa, and the guy who's behind it is a guy named Mike Cordes. And again, he's an entrepreneur and he's a self-made man. He built a company called Nexa Mortgage, which is, I think he founded it in about 20, and it's turned into one of the fastest growing mortgage brokerage companies in the country. And he wanted to get into aviation a few years ago. So I met him a few months ago, and he was building both Jet Nexa, which is the sort of flex jets or net jets style business.
Okay.
And then Fly Nexa. And right now, we're just kind of getting us on the Jet Nexa side. We got a couple citations, CJ3s, they're all brand new, and an M2, a little stubbier version. And then on the Fly Nexa side, we got a couple new DA40 NGs, which are awesome. DA62. Which is an amazing twin engine, by the way. And we've got 4 more DA40s coming and another DA62, and we're probably going to squeeze a 42 in there at some point for different training purposes. So right now it's just the 2 DA40s and a DA62, and we're literally just starting our first couple lessons. Timing was sort of everything here. So networking is one thing. And I'll be also honest, and this is another thing, if you hear enough people who've had chances before, there's a lot of luck that happens too. Sure, chance favors the prepared. I'll give you that. But I was fortunate enough to be at the right place at the right time and meet someone who was just building this, and we kind of hit it off. Yeah. And that worked out. And so as I've gotten in here, not only did I kind of come in and say, okay, well, now I would love to teach, but it's like, okay, I get to build a business now. So we've built cost models for each of the planes, and that's kind of my background, and I can apply it now to, airplanes and figuring out what the unit costs are. So we have profitable business,
sure,
how to market this thing and kind of get it off the ground. Think about, we're using Flight Schedule Pro as our backend as an example. So I've built platforms before. I mean, I was a head of product, built a whole platform, but about that stuff. So I've jumped in to help develop and configure that. And Flight Schedule Pro is kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the space right now, and it's got shortcomings, but it's still really good. But what I'm seeing as well too is my background in technology and platform development really lends itself to helping exploit all the capabilities this platform has. Furthermore, developing a relationship with the company where I'm on weekly calls with them now on feature enhancements and product roadmaps and things of that nature.
Sure.
That's not your typical pilot's background, right?
Right.
And so from the systems itself and how we manage everything, and the goal here, and one of the things that drives me insane is that, anything that's paper-based, I look at and I'm like, oh God, please. We're in a digital world, right?
Please don't come to where I work then.
So much paper. It still happens. It happens. I get it, but everything's going digital, including even the idea of a digital logbook or going into ForeFlight and really using that digital logbook, which is out. It's a pain in the ass to get going, but if you do jump into it, oh my God, it saves you so much time. So how can I go and, with the phone, show up at the hangar, check a plane out, track that plane's, whatever we did, make any kind of maintenance squawks required at the end of that flight, get that all into a system like Flight Schedule Pro, all without ever touching a piece of paper, and then schedule even my 100 hours and the annuals, via that platform. It's a startup. So as a startup, and having managed a few startups in my time, it doesn't matter whether it's aviation, supply chain, data centers, or technology services. The framework is still the same. I need the systems integrated in a way that I can scale. I need to then be able to start attracting students. I need to then have some beta students to kind of be able to allow me to test or pressure test the way we're, offering the curriculum, and, is it seamless? Is it integrated? Can they get to it? Is it all digital? Can we make it even better?
What skills have you found to be most transferable with this process?
Well, I would definitely say there's the general business skills of sales, marketing, customer development, how to interact with people. Again, you and I are old enough that we've had to sell a lot of things in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who's 22 and a young instructor doesn't necessarily know how to sell a lot of stuff yet. They just haven't had to because they've been so focused on getting their aviation credentials in place. So bread and butter for me, as we're starting to do our client development right now is, what are the student prospects? Just a standard sheet to track all that. Rental prospects, standard sheet for that. How are we doing guerrilla marketing and getting out all the Facebook groups and kind of getting posts out there?
Yeah.
How do we do guerrilla marketing and social marketing and leveraging some of the social spaces that are out there? And then building the systems that, that are going to be the foundation for the business to actually scale. So today, if I've only got like 2 or 3 or 4 students, which is true,
mm-hmm.
but I want 200 of them, I don't have the systems ready for 200 students yet. I don't even care if I have 20 planes. I just couldn't scale up digitally to meet that kind of throughput. And I want to make sure that that's ready before we get there. And I can see a lot of schools that kind of, didn't know how to do that. And, they kind of they hit a ceiling, if you will, right? There's a
mm-hmm.
natural constraint to how much they can grow if they're manual, right?
Yeah.
And through automation and through technology, I think we can even go further and bigger with the school and even the jet operations because we're technology first. We hit it off right off the gun and more business thinking, and it just happened to be that we both were applying it to aviation.
That's awesome. I think that's really cool. You've been able to take those skills from before and really apply them to something that could be really cool.
I haven't lost them at all. I haven't lost them at all. I'm actually applying them, full force right now.
Yeah. So with all this planning and preparing and building up a flight school, are you flying yourself?
Yeah, actually, no, I'm flying quite a bit. So I got some students myself. I'm still, just knocked off my double I here recently, teed up for my MEI, hopefully going to test out of that first couple weeks of January. And through, again, have been, through some of these people that I'm meeting, and again, Bob Allen over at Nomadic Aviation, been fortunate enough to kind of go on, fly him around a little bit, or fly with him. I actually got a chance to right seat a 737 with him, going from Goodyear here, small little airport,
mm-hmm. over
to Roswell. And that was my first chance to sit in the right seat of a big plane like that. And oh my God, that was just like, holy, I'm used to setting everything for, maybe 140, 150, 160 knots, maybe 200 at the outside. Here we are at Mach 0.78. I was like, Jesus. This is unbelievable. This is cool. And so, I'm still, in the sort of 400-hour range, kind of, but kind of getting more and more in. So I do a fair amount of flying every week, but I like the balance too.
Yeah.
Right? I like to be able to have my kind of business stuff being applied on a daily basis. For instance, a couple students came in and I, got a new instructor here and making sure he gets off and running with the student on Wednesday. I've got another kind of couple students coming in and, again, making sure that we've got the processes in place. I've got instructors who are able to kind of follow the curriculum that we're still developing, right?
Yeah.
So again, there's still just a lot of stuff we got to kind of do on the fly, but that's kind of startup too. And that also is helpful to have been through this process a few times in other areas, because you kind of know that, it's never going to be perfect and there's always something to do, but it's better to kind of take action and kind of learn as you go.
So what advice would you have for anyone who's thinking about changing careers into something aviation related?
Oh God. Well, easy. Do it. No, but I believe, there really is. And again, I go back and make the point. Aviation's only 100 years old, a little bit more. So it's a relatively young industry. It's not like banking, which has been around for, thousands of years or whatever. And we are truly at an inflection point where I also looked at the data, right? So today we have around, give or take, 800,000 registered pilots, I believe, in the United States. And that's down from about 20 years ago, which I think was up in the mid 800s.
Okay.
And so of those 800,000 pilots, if you kind of take out private and student and everybody underneath, basically you're kind of left with about a cohort of around 150 to 200,000 kind of professional pilots. It's a pretty small group of people. right?
Mm-hmm.
That was another thing that teed me up to. There's a lot of opportunity if I can get into that professional circle. So then how do you kind of get started? Well, it always starts with a discovery flight. Make sure that you can do it. A lot of people who think they can fly, it's a bit of a challenge sometimes. I mean, I remember when I did that first stall, I pooped my pants. I mean, that was, I don't know if I was ready or not for that plane to slide backwards, but I was like, oh my God. And now even looking back when I did my first solo landing, I mean, literally my first solo landing, I almost floated off the runway. And I mean, I was just like, oh my God, but I had to get my, nothing happened and got back and got into it. And, I've had some moments along the way. Like I said, I was really afraid of heights. So even like being in a small plane and flying around took me a little bit to get used to it. Now, ironically, jumping from planes has helped me a little bit to get over that. But also, I know it's a little weird, but now also realizing too that, having done enough emergency situations, enough gliding in these planes, that planes are super safe. If you go wrong, especially if you prepare well, even teaching, as I tell people, I'm teaching people, the safety and standards and stuff like that. So I'm, teaching them to be safe pilots, but what we're really teaching is the skills to be ready for when the unexpected does happen. And it will happen, right? But realizing that you got a lot in your arsenal to help you get around if you've prepared right, if you follow the rules, if I've got my extra fuel in the tank, if I've prepared my alternate airport, I've done my proper flight planning, it all goes into that, right? And that's kind of part of the foundation that you're learning. So, longer answer than I think you probably wanted, but I would certainly say for people wanting to get into it, don't hesitate, jump in and get a discovery flight. That's where you're going to know whether or not you want to fly. But the opportunity when you're there and you're going to be in an internship phase, that's another thing I'm learning, right? So this gap between 400 and 50, it's kind of like residency in medical school or in the medical track, right? You're kind of the whipping boy of the industry to some extent. You have to do all the jobs that no one really wants to do, and that's okay. And you're not going to get paid very well. Let me be clear on that one. But the opportunity, if you can get through that and you can survive those 3, 4, 5 years to get to that professional level, because I've only been flying for a little over, we'll call it 2.5 years now. Well, let's say 3, 4, 5 years. I mean, within 4 years, 3.5, 4 years, you can get to a place where you're making back to, $200,000 a year as a pilot. I would challenge anybody in a 4-year degree today at a liberal arts school, that's throwing down, 2 or 3, if they're going to make that kind of money coming out of school. So transitioning, you got to be ready for about 3 to 4 years of grunt work, but it's definitely doable. So I'd say that's kind of the bottom line. Step 1, do the discovery flight, see if you're bitten by the bug. Step 2, look at your financial situation. Do you have the ability to do something for the next 3 to 4 years, congruent with what your lifestyle is currently today? Because that's what it's going to take. And then just buckle down and you can get it done.
Sure can. Well, Richard, I can't thank you enough for coming on. I really do appreciate your time and for sharing your story and where you're at now. So a lot of good insight in there. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you once again to Richard for joining me on this episode of Fly the Transition. Really appreciated him sharing his story with us. And one of the biggest takeaways that I had is that just because you move from one career field in aviation, it doesn't mean that those skills that you had before just go away. A lot of that can still be transferable in some cases, even if it's the teamwork and communication, or in Richard's case, his ability to take his startup work and apply that to a flight school now. So really interesting perspective there. The other thing that I took away from that is all the prep work. Now, I know we've talked before with other guests about all the preparation that people do as they transition from one career into the next. But as we went along, the thing that stood out for me from Richard is all that prep and all that goes into that is just arsenal for your toolbox when you start to make that transition or start applying for those aviation-related jobs. So really great insight, and thank you once again, Richard, for sharing your story with all of us. If you want to get in touch with Richard, I'll have some contact information down in the show notes. And for those of you that are on the techie or supply chain side of the world, he does have a podcast, Supplychain Next. I will also put a link for that down in the show notes. Before we get talking about our next guest, I want to just mention quickly, AirVenture is just around the corner. I will be there for a good chunk of the week, probably Sunday through midday Thursday. I'll head back to Minnesota. During that time, I'll be doing some interviews for Flying Midwest, but also doing some research for this podcast and making some time to try to have some meet and greets with folks along the way. Stay tuned to my social medias, both here and on Flying Midwest, to see when we plan on having those meet and greets. We'll try to do probably 2 of them throughout the week, so stay tuned for that information. And as I mentioned in the ad section, it's a great time to get your Fly the Transition merchandise Our Sharp logo that we have is featured on a number of items. If you want to represent the podcast at AirAdventure or any of your other summer events, make sure you go check that out. flyingmidwest.com/merch. Now on to our next episode. We'll be joined by Seth Bunker, who is a first officer with one of the major airlines. Seth had been a captain at one of the regional airlines and made his way into the majors. But where his story is unique is the way in which he did it. On top of working that flow from the regionals into the majors, Seth was an enlisted aircrew member in the United States Air Force and Air Force Reserve for a number of years. We'll take the opportunity to learn a bit about that path from, say, a flight engineer spot in Air Force aircraft to piloting an airliner. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Fly the Transition, and until next time, keep your eyes on the skies and your dreams soaring high.
You've been listening to Fly the Transition. Life is too short for you not to do what you love. And our passion is to give you all the tools you need to make the transition from doing what you do to being in the aviation industry. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, you can reach out by email at flythetransition@gmail.com. Find us on Facebook at Fly the Transition. And the website for Flying Midwest Media is flyingmidwest.com. Keep soaring. See you next time on Fly the Transition.